Good evening all together, and first of all, a very warm thank you for this really very nice introduction. Thank you very much, dear Professor Klisovic. Thank you very much, dear Professor Grimic. Thank you very much to the Boell Foundation, to Helse, Herr Poltermann, and Paola Petric. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's a pleasure to have this possibility to engage with you about a theme which is becoming more and more important, which is at first sight very little to do with international politics, but maybe, as I will argue later, there are some connections. The theme is, as you can see here, I'm talking about the political origins of something that could be labeled authoritarian populism in Europe, in the consolidated democracies of the Western world, and also at the margins of those consolidated democracies. It is essentially about the fact that we have, by now, in almost all of the old, after World War II, consolidated Western democracies in Europe and in North America, that we have in almost all of those countries a right-wing populist party, which is around 20–25%. And that's a sort of a very broad development, a broad development that makes it likely that we have to look, if we ask for the causes, for the origins, outside of the specific countries. We all tend to explain the rise of those parties by looking into a country. And if we talk in Germany about the AfD, then people say, well, it's the fault of the Chancellor of Frau Merkel because she opened the borders and stuff like that. But at the same time, there were already many other of those right-wing populists in many other countries. So there seems to be a sort of a general, if you may, a sort of a structural development for the rise of right-wing populist parties. And at the same time, and in addition to that, we have in countries like Poland, like Hungary, like Turkey, now also in the United States, even a government that is more or less controlled by a populist party and the leaders of the populist party, as it is obviously the case in the US. So I'm asking, why did this happen? That we have essentially the rise of something that may be labeled authoritarian populism, now almost 3 decades after the 1990s, when liberal cosmopolitanism was considered by many as the most successful thing that has dominated, that has won the sort of ideological competition. And that has, I mean, to some extent also delivered in the last 3 decades, in the sense that we have a growing inequality on the global level, that we have a rising human development index in the last 2 decades, much sharper than ever before in history. And nevertheless, we see now a very strong counter-movement with the rise of those authoritarian populists in many parts of the world. I want to offer you essentially 3 explanations in this short lecture, which can be seen to some extent as competing with each other, but can be also seen to some extent as being complementary. But before that, I'm saying a little bit why I chose the term authoritarian populism for this kind of movement that I want to explain. Almost all of those authoritarian populists have a common policy profile. And this common policy profile can be probably described by 3 major issues that are common. All of those movements are very critical of transferring authority to European or international institutions. There's an emphasis on popular sovereignty. There's an emphasis on the need to run a country by domestic majorities and to avoid interventions by foreign institutions, be they European or international. There's a sort of agreement that those parties are critical of open borders regarding economic issues, and of course also regarding the movement of people. Here we enter the field of the migration issues. And thirdly, there's a certain tendency and a certain commonality of all of those movements that I mentioned against something that has been labeled multiculturalism. There's a certain emphasis on the national culture and the need essentially that the national culture has to be dominant. It's now obvious that you can have this policy profile and that you can stand for those positions without being authoritarian or without being an authoritarian populist. So I mean, these are three political positions, and there's no question that there's nothing undemocratic to vote for a party that stands for those three positions. But then on the other hand, if you look to the way authoritarian populists present this policy profile and present their political positions, there are three additional commonalities, and those three additional commonalities are essentially the reason why I label them here now authoritarian populists. All those parties, and again, I'm talking about the right-wing populist parties in Western Europe and North America, and I'm talking about of some of the authoritarian populist leaders in Eastern Europe or in countries like Turkey. All of those parties essentially have an anti-liberal, or as Orban would put it, an illiberal position, in the sense that in case of conflict, they say the majority, the will of the majority of the people is more important than individual rights. This whole business with individual rights is by now overdrawn. It's important that it is the majority will which runs the country. A second element is that there is a sense of anti-pluralism involved, because there is always an emphasis on a notion of majority which is, as I would say, very much deproceduralized. Of course, if we talk about democracies, majorities are important. There's no question about that. But then again, majority is not something that is given and that is the mere aggregation of individual interests. It involves certain processes in order to find out what the will of the majority is, and that is open public debates, that is tolerance towards other positions, that is the willingness to listen to people who are not part of the winning coalition. And in that sense, the notion of majority is very much a procedural notion. Many of the authoritarian populists, or often those authoritarian populists, present a sort of an anti-pluralist understanding of majority by essentially saying, well, we know what the majority is and we fight now for this will of the majority. I would say famous is the Austrian leader of the right-wing populist party who had on his election posters this sentence, he knows what we want. And that is a sort of an illustration of this deproceduralized notion of the majority. The leader knows what we want, and therefore there's actually no need to find out what the majority wants. So that's the anti-pluralist moment. And the third moment, I want to emphasize this, probably because I'm a global governance, I'm an IR person with traditions to Richard Falk, the doctor father of Professor Simic. It is anti-multilateral to an extent that it becomes democratically not defensible. If democracy involves the notion that all those who are affected by a political decision should have a say in this political decision, some forms of anti-internationalism and anti-multiculturalism become highly problematic. I take now a sort of an extreme and maybe sort of rhetorical example, but consider for a moment you would be a citizen of a Pacific island. You would live on a Pacific island. And then you would hear that the American president has decided, I don't care about climate change. and I don't care if some of those islands in the Pacific will not be there anymore in 5 or 6 years. Would you consider this decision by the American president, which has an effect on your life, on the destiny of your life, as democratic? No, you would probably argue, hey, that's something where I also have a right to say something. And therefore, an extreme form of anti-internationalism, of anti-multiculturalism, the form which essentially neglects that some of our decisions have externalities for others, that is also something that I would describe as part of the authoritarian populist thinking. And therefore, this policy profile that I described in the beginning, which can be associated with a democratic party, becomes sort of authoritarian when it comes in the form of a party program which is anti-liberal, anti-plural, and anti-multilateral. And therefore, the term authoritarian populism is used here in order to explain this rise of this movement that I label authoritarian populists. There's, of course, a final element of authoritarian populists, and that is that they very often tend to juxtapose a sort of a liberal, cosmopolitan elite, which is small, rich, and benefiting from open borders, with the pure people which are living in a country. In that sense, there's a certain tendency to say, well, there's a majority of the people, and there's this little caste of a liberal elite, and we juxtapose those two parts, and people who are on the side of the real people, of the pure people living in a country, they should take the side of the populists. The problem with this sort of anti-elitism is, to some extent, that it creates a sort of a notion of a little group which runs the country, but the debates that we have about those three issues that I mentioned in the beginning, about open borders, about the question whether we want to transfer authority to the EU or not, and similar things, these issues are very much issues where we see in many societies essentially just two sides, two parts. And many who are not part of the elite also take a liberal cosmopolitan stand and are for open borders, are for the transfer of the political authority to the European Union or international institutions. So we are not talking about a juxtaposition between a small elite and the pure people. We are talking about a divide between two groups in modern societies, and therefore it is sort of a, at least with a German background, it reminds you to some extent to the way some of those elites were described 100 years ago. So this is the reason why I call those guys, this movement, authoritarian populists. I would say, if you look to the literature, if you consider the debates, there are essentially three or two dominant explanations, and I want to add a third one to those two dominant explanations. The dominant explanation, one is more or less an economic explanation. It says essentially, well, there has been globalization, and globalization has produced winners and losers. And those who are on the losing side have now enough of these policies that created globalization, and therefore they organize in parties which challenge the globalization. And these are, by now, the authoritarian populists. So in this sense, it's very often the growing material inequality within the nation states, in spite of the fact that inequality on the global level has decreased. In many societies, within the societies, equality has increased. And it is this increase within the societies which is used as the reason in the economic account for the rise of those authoritarian populists. And clearly, there are some developments that support this explanation. Most famously, probably the Rust Belt voters for Donald Trump in the US, also the voters in Northern England for the Brexit. There we had clearly the surprise that some of those voters who formerly voted for the Democrats actually voted for Trump, and those who formerly voted or traditionally voted for the Labour Party voted for Brexit. So I mean, here we have some indication for this economic explanation of the rise of authoritarian populism. I would argue, however, that this explanation has some serious problems. I mean, it cannot explain all what we see. And I would put forward three reasons. The first reason is it still remains, to some extent, hard to understand why those people who are losers of globalization and ask essentially the nation state to protect them by building up the welfare system, that those groups go for right-wing populists, that those groups go for authoritarian populists. The social benefit promises are much more clearer on the side of the leftist parties. So if you are really interested in economic protection and in the building up of a social welfare state, it does not sound very plausible that all over the world, not only in one or two countries, but all over the world, it is the right-wing populists who win, and it's not the leftist parties. So that's something which I would consider as a puzzle if I go for the economic explanation. I also would say it is to some extent a puzzle that in societies like Poland and Turkey, and these are relatively clear cases, where one can easily argue that globalization has produced a rise of wealth that is unknown in the history of those two countries. So two countries which on the country level side have to be considered as winners of globalization. Both Poland is a winner of Europeanization with an enormous rise in the economy in the last 20 years, with an enormous rise of wealth in Poland. Even more clearly the case in Turkey, with enormous growth rates in the last 15 or 20 years. And especially in those countries, we see the victory of authoritarian populists like Krasnodębski and Erdogan. And I would say this is a puzzle to some extent as well. If you want to explain the rise by authoritarian populists by looking at globalization losers, it's to some extent surprising that the authoritarian populists are strongest in countries which have gained most from globalization. A third reason why I do consider this economic explanation as only partially convincing is that we have those 20 to 25% of authoritarian populists in almost all of the Western democracies, as I mentioned, quite independent of the amount of inequality in those societies. So you have those 20 to 25% in Scandinavian countries where you have some rise of inequality, true, but a completely different level of inequality than in the United States or in Great Britain. So in the liberal societies like the Great Britain and the US, you have the same amount of authoritarian populists than in the Scandinavian countries with a very strong welfare state. And that speaks also to some extent against this inequality explanation. Therefore, and that's the second dominant explanation, therefore many put forward a sort of a cultural explanation. And according to the cultural explanation, it is right-wing populism is mainly a sort of a cultural backlash against sort of a liberalism going bananas, of a liberalism that just went too far. I mean, especially if you go to some of the cities in Western Europe, it may be easily understandable what I mean when I say liberalism going bananas. There is, of course, a sort of a re-stratification in the society based on cultural attitudes. It's the Pierre Bourdieu notion of the fine difference, that you have to behave, that you have to live in a certain way in order to be considered as chic. Otherwise you are out. Otherwise you are considered as not really valuable. And that means you have to live in the city. That means you have to at least know some people with different sexual orientation. You have to like certain music. And if you don't do this, then you are considered as, well, sort of boring, second class. In that sense, what has started as a movement in the name of pluralism, in the name of tolerance, please be tolerant to homosexuals, please be tolerant to other tastes of music, listen also to world music and not only to the local music, has changed over time, and it has become a marker of social stratification, that if you like world music, you are in. If you like local music, you are out. If you live in a sort of an environment where different sexual orientations are often the case, then you are in. If you live in the traditional small family outside of the city, you are out. And this sort of strong form of cultural development has, according to this explanation, produced a significant amount of backlash. And to some extent, or I would say the strongest support for this kind of explanation, which is put forward by some very famous political scientists, Pippa Norris, Ronald Inglehart, they make essentially the cultural backlash explanation. And there are some good reasons to say this is important. If you look with me for a moment again to the US and to the election of Donald Trump, and you just look at the 10 biggest cities in the United States. In the 10 biggest cities, Hillary Clinton won more than 80% of the vote. In many of the rural areas, Donald Trump won more than 90% of the vote. This is a sort of a conflict line, of a cleavage that is extremely strong, much stronger than we know from the age of a strong opposition of the class parties, where in Germany, in some of the labor cities, you had maybe 65 or 68% for the Social Democrats, and in the most conservative parts of Bavaria, you had maybe 60 or 65% for the Conservative Party, but never 80 versus 90%. And that shows that this divide between the city people and the rural people is very, very, very important. And therefore, the backlash explanation has some plausibility. But then again, can this explain everything? Why do we have this, for example, strong anti-nationalism? Why are those people at the same time against the EU, in spite of the fact that the EU is not famous for feminism and LGBT rights or something like this? So in that sense, there is something else in it that goes beyond the cultural explanation. And that leads me to the political explanation that I just want to present to you, and I want to show some data in favor of this political explanation, and then I hope we can enter in a discussion. The political explanation is one that does consider this, let me call it cleavage between liberal cosmopolitans and more or less communitarian, nationalist-oriented people as almost a side effect of the way the class cleavage was handled from the 1960s on. And a side effect that was then accentuated by globalization. The basic idea is that essentially after World War II, we saw in all of the Western democracies a sort of a big historical compromise. And the big historical compromise can be easily described as one in which capital got open borders for all the economic activities, and the left essentially got the rise of the welfare state. So this deal, this big historical deal between that involved open borders and the rise of the welfare state, which was also implemented to some extent in the international institutions that were developed after World War II. This essentially created new political systems and made a type of party very strong that emerged in the 1960s. Otto Kirchheimer called it catch-all parties. In German, we call it Volksparteien. The sort of party which tries to convince all the people and to get really a majority of 40 or 50% of the votes. So those people's parties, those catch-all parties, which try essentially to bring together very different interests into one party, that was then, of course, the Social Democratic Party and the Conservative parties, they established a completely new political style in all of the Western democracies at the same time. And this political style involved a lot of moderation, a professionalism on the side of politics, a growing distance between the people sitting in the parliament and running the country in the government and the voters. So a sort of an alienation of the political elite from the voters. It also brought a necessity to find compromises, which then, of course, are different from the promises during the election campaigns. And that essentially led to a situation in which already Robert Dahl, he's a very famous American political scientist, argued already in the 1960s that this change in the political mode towards moderation, towards professional parties, towards a growing distance between the party elites and the voters leads to a system which will be considered by the people as much too distanced, as bureaucratized, as too pragmatic, and in a sense as run by experts. That was already Dahl in 1963, making essentially this prediction that those kind of parties which are trying to win the vote of everyone, which are always willing to make compromises, which are always build coalitions in order to bring in many people, that those parties have to make so many compromises that they will lose the trust of the voters. That already in 1963. And if you look at the trust values for something that I would describe as, it's wrong, the nicht is wrong, for something that I would describe as majoritarian institutions. Majoritarian institutions are those institutions in the democracy who justify their decision by saying, I'm speaking in the name of the majority. And this is essentially parties and parliaments. These are the majoritarian institutions. They are elected, and when they do something, they don't need to argue that they have very good epistemic reasons for what they do. They essentially have to argue, well, it's the will of the majority. And these are the majoritarian institutions, and those majoritarian institutions are, of course, extremely important for a democracy. But you see here that already from the 1960s on, it is data available only for 3 countries here, that is France, US, and Sweden. You see a decline in the trust of parties and parliaments. So there's a declining trust in the belief that those majoritarian institutions are really acting in the name of the people. And this, I mean, to put it more methodologically serious, is a general trend that you see around those 17 OECD countries for which World Value Survey data is available for over a longer period of time. You see here, does this mic work as well? Okay, you see here it starts already in the 1980s, that it goes down for all the 17 countries for a very long time. We will come up to this upswing in the last years later on. But that's the first step in the political explanation. You at first the big historical compromise, and as a result of this big historical compromise, we have a permanently declining trust into majoritarian institutions being parties and parliaments. As a result of this, in the next step, and also as a result of the political mode of compromise, of moderation, of finding the right solution that helps everyone, we have an enormous rise of non-majoritarian institutions, of institutions within a democratic political system which justify their decisions not on the basis of majorities, which justify their decisions in the name of that it is right, that it is the high epistemic quality of the decision, that it is the right decision looked from the perspective of an expert. And you can see this within all of the Western democracies, essentially from the 1970s on. And that's a movement that is global, that you have a strengthening of central banks who essentially set the exchange rates and the inflation rate. So central banks became stronger all over the world, especially in Western democracies. Constitutional courts became much more stronger in all of the Western world. And also international institutions, which are also, in this sense, non-majoritarian institutions, because they negotiate something that's very often based on expertise. It is not the result of an election campaign, it is the result of professional people sitting together and deciding what is the right health policy on the global level. What do we need to do in order to increase global health? What do we need to do in order to reduce poverty? That would be the World Bank. So I mean, that's very often an expertocratic policy. And as you all know, that's of course also the claim, the critical claim put forward against the EU. These are all bureaucrats and experts sitting in Brussels. There is no democracy behind it. So I mean, what you see essentially as an immediate result of the decline in the trust to majoritarian institutions, decline of trust in parties and parliaments, is a rise in the importance, in the relative political importance of non-majoritarian institutions. I have now some data by now for all regulatory agencies, which are also non-majoritarian institutions, and they essentially have almost the same development than those international institutions that you see here. So an enormous rise in the importance of those institutions. However, non-majoritarian institutions, just remember, I said courts, constitutional courts, I said central banks, and I said international institutions. They are not neutral towards the three policies that I mentioned in the beginning, because clearly courts, Supreme Courts, defend, first of all, individual rights. Central banks defend, first of all, monetary-oriented economic policies, keep the inflation low. And of course, international institutions do not defend nationalist policies, but defend a transfer of political authority, of more political authority towards the European and international institutions. So the argument is, with the strengthening of those non-majoritarian institutions, you essentially have a body of political decision makers which are in favor of liberal cosmopolitanism and essentially against nationalist policies. And you can see this here, that's based on data on 5 countries. If you look at the claims, I need to explain this. Here, the first one very up here, over 2, that's essentially in the middle between cosmopolitan positions and communitarian positions. This is on an index where you have on the one hand a radical liberal cosmopolitan position and on the other hand a radical communitarian position. 2.5 would be in the middle, and what you see here are essentially parties and parliaments. All the other dots here are either the courts, the experts, or the IOs. All those are much more on the liberal cosmopolitan side. So what I'm trying to say is non-majoritarian institutions do have a liberal cosmopolitan bias. They work against those who are in favor of closed borders, who are in favor for national institutions and against international institutions, and are in favor of majority will against individual rights. All those non-majoritarian institutions take side in this debate between the cosmopolitans and the communitarians. And that essentially means that all those people who have the policy profile, I go back, who have this sort of policy profile, that they feel not anymore really represented by politics, that they have the feeling that it is non-majoritarian institutions that run the country, that dominate the country, but not represent their interests. In that sense, there's a tendency to say, well, then we have to look for a party which defends our interests, and that's essentially then the authoritarian populists who stand for anti-liberal, anti-plural, and anti-multilateral position. So we have essentially a rise of this whole development of right-wing populist parties that you see here. Over time, it's taken the same 17 countries for which I have shown the decline of trust in majoritarian institutions. And you see here that now at the very end, when those right-wing populist parties become strong, when they begin to emphasize majority, when they begin to emphasize the will of the people as put forward in the parliament, that in that moment you also see again a slight increase in the trust of majoritarian institutions again. So what does this mean before we enter into the discussion? It means, in my view, that we are entering a very difficult time in which essentially three movements strengthen each other, and they all together essentially jeopardize the sort of post-war liberal order that has developed. Nationalism weakens the EU. Without a strong EU, the multilateral international order is weakened, and a international system with a weak liberal order, which very much is a competitive state system, strengthens nationalism again, and there we have a sort of a devil's cycle, that those developments strengthen each other, that we have a rise of nationalism, that we have a rise of criticism of international institutions, and that we have a weakening of the EU. And those essentially leads to a situation where I personally say I don't know what will happen if there will be a big economic crisis that will come probably soon. We had now 10, 12 years after the financial crisis, a time of growing economies in large parts of the world. And many signs point to the possibility that now a downturn swing will start, that there maybe will be another financial crisis or another form of economic crisis. What happens in this kind of situation with the democracies, with the liberal order, with the EU? There's a possibility that this crisis will push them very close to the edge. At the same time, the political explanation points to a sort of a dilemma in which I would describe myself, and you have probably heard this, that's no problem, as a liberal. It's very, very hard, the position that on the one hand you have to criticize the existing institutions for being maybe not inclusive enough, for being too expertocratic, for excluding political competition on the level of the international institutions, and at the same time defend those institutions because they are much better than the alternative as provided by the authoritarian populists. And in that sense, it is a sort of a dilemma that you have essentially to criticize and defend those existing institutions at the same time. So you have to change them in order to defend them. And that's, politically speaking, the most difficult task then you can get. Either, I mean, you defend something and you say it's great, it's wonderful, that's easy, or you say it's horrible, it's bad, and you attack it, that's also relatively easy. The most complicated thing is actually what we have should be defended, but we need to change it so that they can be defended. That's a very complicated position. But the argument is that essentially there's no other choice for at least those who believe in liberal cosmopolitan values, because going on with a sort of a technocratic mode of political decision making will make authoritarian populists even stronger. And the alternative, as discussed in some of the conservative crises, maybe we should change our policies so that the policies get closer to the authoritarian populists. That sounds to me like suicide out of fear of death, and also not a very sensible strategy. In this sense, the political explanation may be good in terms of explanatory value, but of course it shows that we are living in very difficult political times. Thank you very much.